in Learning Outcome 4, we're going to look at the application of ethical and responsible sourcing within an organisation. Understanding how ethical and responsible sourcing is built into the frameworks that we operate to, and how we can ensure that we as procurement professionals are acting in a responsible manner. So we generally talk about a number of aspects when we talk about ethical and responsible sourcing. Everything from how we conduct ourselves within the profession, so ensuring that we're acting in a responsible way in regards to not accepting bribery, understanding that corruption and fraud can happen within our supply chains and trying to weed that out and making sure that our supply chains are free from those type of things like human rights violations and the use of modern slavery, which we'll talk about. We're going to talk about the application of the SIPS Code of Conduct, which is how an organisation and how procurement professionals within the organisation can try and instill a certain level of integrity when it comes to ethical sourcing and responsible sourcing. We're going to have a look at ethical codes of practice as well. So there's a code of conduct for SIPs and there's a code of ethics for SIPs. The code of conduct is more of an overview of how to act responsibly, and I would say responsibly rather than ethically, whereas the SIPs code of ethics focuses on primarily an individual within an organisation and how they operate. There is some crossover in there. The code of conduct is a much wider terminology and a wider framework, whereas the SIPS code of ethics fits within there and the way we act. So hopefully we'll identify those little nichey things. We'll talk about environmental factors. When we talk about environmental factors in regards to environment, in regards to responsible sourcing, we generally start talking about building in concepts like the triple bottom line there. The triple bottom line, John Elkington suggested that an organisation, in order to be sustainable, needed to focus on a number of different factors, not just our profitability in regards to the economic profitability, but in order to be sustainable, we have to have a focus on people and the social implications of the way that our organisation acts. And we need to have a focus on the planet, so not the environmental implications that we have. And that environmental implications are making sure that we're acting in a responsible way towards the environment to make things sustainable. So using recycled goods. We could talk about the UK hierarchy of waste when we talk about environmental factors in social responsibility. So we talk about things like the hierarchy of waste. So reuse, reduce, recycle and rethink. This idea that we should be constantly a reassessing of what we're doing. Can we recycle? Can we reuse? Can we reduce what we use? Can we rethink it so that it's not something that we need to use in the first place? We talk about trying to use virgin materials, trying to move away from using virgin materials, should I say, which means trying to use more recycled goods. We try and talk about you being more energy efficient, using renewable energy. We talk about using products and packaging that maybe is less impactful on the environment. We might talk about things like carbon footprint and carbon offsetting. So these are some of the factors that we talk about when we talk about the environment, the disposable of waste products, and that's done in a responsible way. When we talk about things like the environmental factors, we'll probably bring into things like how are we affecting the environment. So if we're buying from abroad, is that going to have a bigger carbon footprint because it has the pollution that's associated with the transportation? So lots of things to consider when we talk about environmental factors. We'll talk about things like supporting information on ethical practices in supply chains, quotations and tenders. So how do we ensure that we have suppliers that are quoting and bidding and they're aligned towards what we're actually hoping to achieve? How can we drive and align our suppliers into the same way of thinking that we are having when it comes to ethical, sustainable and responsible sourcing? Well, the first thing is we can communicate to them how we want them to deliver ethical and responsible products to us. So that might include things like building it into our specifications. building it into our contract. So we might ask for things within our specifications for them to adhere to certain awarding bodies or accreditations, such as the International Labour Organization or the Ethical Trading Initiative. There's accreditations that we can get, like Social Accountability 8000, which is an accreditation to make sure that there is the supplier is working in a socially responsible way. When it comes to the environment, we might build things into there. We might build things into working. The supplier must have accreditations, things like ISO 14001, which is the International Organization of Standards Environmental Management System. So things can be built in to our specifications, into our tenders, specification contracts, but also into our tendering. It could be something as a part of the award criteria that we look for. So in our selection criteria, we talked about that supplier selection, supplier appraisal. We can ask them to have accreditations, but we can also, in our awarding criteria, have a weighting that suggests that suppliers who are doing more in regards to social responsibility, to more social value-adding activities, environmental responsible activities, that they can get better awarded and they can more likely to win the contracts. We can also do it by training, by having supplier development programs, by building things in with our suppliers to make sure that they are constantly working and developing that. And we do that by having things like monitoring and KPIs, continuous improvement programs with our suppliers. So when we talk about ethical practice, how do we actually instill it? How do we embed it with our suppliers? How do we educate them in what we want? And that's through communication, and it can be through specifications, contracts, award criteria. It can be through education. It can be with development. It can be with training. There's lots of things that we can do to try and embed it and instill it into the products that we're getting from those suppliers. I've mentioned John Elkerton and the triple bottom line. The big thing there is about understanding the balance. Depending on what organisation or what you're buying, that balance might be different. If you're working for a public sector body, then the idea of those planet and people, that sustainable factors around social value and environmental impact, they are going to be more heavily weighted generally in a tender because there's legislation to suggest that they have to do that. There's the Social Value Act. There's the greening agenda and the greening targets for the public sector, where they have to reduce down their carbon footprint by 2020. So there's legal kind of impetus to suggest that they have to build it in more. Whereas in the private sector, they might be more likely to build it in for public relations, for marketing capability. It might be that being greener might reduce down costs. It might reduce down their tax bill. It might reduce down their transport costs if they buy local rather than global. So there's lots of things to consider when we're thinking about the idea of understanding the triple bottom line of why would an organisation do it, what are they trying to achieve, and is it appropriate to do that? For a lot of the organisations who we teach to, a lot of the buyers say that we don't really build in a lot of these. It is more primarily profit focused rather than planet and people, because that's what our customers are demanding from us. There is a very interesting study around the coffee industry where 80% of all customers who buy coffee from your Starbucks and your Costas, they suggested that the customers in surveys suggested that they were really bothered about the environmental impact, recycled goods, fair trade, and all of these kind of socially orientated requirements. However, when it came to having higher priced products that were socially responsibly sourced, that customers actually chose the cheaper option knowing that it didn't have those requirements. So it's about understanding your customer base, and not just what your customer might say, but how they act and how they respond. So that is all going to have the pressure onto procurement about the way that we buy. We have to instill certain levels, and those might be compliance to make sure we adhere to the law, but is it always going to be driven by best practice if we know our customers won't buy it? So just something to consider there. So how do we adopt sustainable practice? Well, we build it into our standards, into our specifications. We work to accreditations and standards like the standards of the ILO, the ETI, and ISO 14001, and all of these things to try and help us to build those things in. Consider the social impact of organisations' behaviours. As I say, it depends on the organisation. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. There'll be a huge a range, a spectrum. There'll be on a spectrum of how profit orientated or socially orientated an organisation is, and that will be based around a number of factors such as profit, customer requirements, customers' needs, and the desire from your stakeholder groups. And then expand reporting frameworks to include ecological and social performance. So it's been a widely kind of published and highlighted that a number of organisations now like to promote what they're doing. Nike's a very good example that when they got in trouble a few years ago for using maybe not the most appropriate labour practices within their supply chain, and their initial response was, well, this is what happens in those countries, it's not really our problem, to being heavily criticised, losing a lot of their market share. So now that they were the first organisation to report on their supply chain about the conditions in the supply chain and the training that they've done within their supply chain to try and promote themselves and to try and make them look, trying to recover some of that bad press that they'd received. So the first thing we need to talk about anyway is bribery, corruption, fraud, human rights and modern slavery. This idea that we have a responsibility within the procurement function to ensure that we're operating in a responsible, both ethically and socially responsible manner. So first thing to talk about is bribery. Bribery is the act of giving someone something of value to persuade them to do something. It's something that causes a conflict of interest. Anything that causes a conflict of interest is never going to generally be a good thing for an organisation, because it undermines the buying process. It means that the person who is being bribed is acting in their own personal interest rather than the interest of the organisation. That can lead to substandard products. It can lead to increased price. It can lead to complaints. It can also damage our reputation within the marketplace. If our suppliers know that they have no chance of winning the business, or they know that generally we act in an irresponsible manner, then it's going to ruin our reputation as a business, and that can lead to people boycotting our products. It can lead to our suppliers not wanting to deal with us. It can lead to ultimately criminal fines. So bribery is something that in the UK is covered by the Bribery Act. It's a statute, and it suggests that there are 4 things that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the process of what bribery is, the process of what bribing someone is. So being bribed and bribing. We need to know about, there's a whole section about what is and isn't appropriate for public officials or officials in the public sector. And there is also a section around an organisation's requirement when it comes to the Bribery Act. And that is to suggest that if an organisation does not make their staff aware of what bribery is and the implications of bribery, then it will not be the individual who is held responsible, it will be the organisation. So virtually everybody I speak to in the procurement world has had to sign a something to say that they've read or have been made aware of what bribery is. It might have been in the induction that you signed or the handbook that you signed, but generally all organisations have something where you've signed it or you've done a training course to suggest you know what bribery is, because otherwise it's the organisations that are accountable and not the individual. Okay, so bribery falls under the remit of corruption. Corruption is a wider term where somebody acts in an unethical activity within the organisation. Bribery, abuse of power, deception and embezzlement. Again, corruption is something that we should look out for. It's something we should be aware of. How are we aware? Well, the implications are obviously going to be poor products, damage to our reputation. How are we aware of it? Might be a question. They've asked the question around how do we prevent bribery? How do we prevent corruption within our supply chains? And you could say things like educating the suppliers, educating our stakeholders, internal and external, to what is and isn't acceptable. Working to accreditations and standards, working to standards and like the SIPS ethics the SIP standard of ethics, the SIP's code of conduct is something that we can work to. You can say rotation of buyers is a good way to prevent fraud and corruption. By rotating our buyers, it means that we don't get relationships that get too cozy. We have different people looking at things from different aspects. Things like separation of duties, so that nobody has control to manage the whole process. So if you raise a PO, you can't sign off the delivery note, for example, and things like that, the invoice. Delegation of spend to make sure that only people with appropriate levels of authority can sign off on certain things. So there's lots of things that we can do to kind of prevent bribery and corruption within our supply chain. It might be training programs with your suppliers. The other thing is, if we find that there is problems within our supply chain, not just to sweep it under the carpet, to look at why they've appeared, and if sometimes just getting rid of a supplier isn't going to solve the problem in the long run. So have we worked with suppliers to develop them to solve the problems if there has been these things that we found that probably aren't appropriate. When we talk about human rights, again, we've got the Human Rights Act in the UK, that's our legislation, and it's making sure that people are treated in a fair and equal manner and there is no discrimination. There should be a freedom from slavery, torture, degrading treatment, which all sounds pretty good to me. So we have the Human Rights Act, and again, it's about understanding the standards that we want to work to. Just because we've got the Human Rights Act doesn't mean that every country that we work with have the same standards, have the same requirements. We have the Health and Safety Act, we have the Equality Act. All of these are UK-based minimum standards. And we've got to try and instill that within our supply chain. That's our responsibility. If we think that something isn't appropriate, if we think that we can increase the level of human rights, increase the level of working conditions, then we might have a responsibility to do that. In a lot of countries, they won't have the same legal requirement. So is it something that we can suggest, improve, building out our specs and our contracts to try and improve those in other countries? And there are a lot of large organisations that are very good at increasing the base level and standard of working conditions in other countries that might not have been that way before. Okay. Modern day slavery, it's a common thing that we hear all the time now. It's constantly in the press. It accounts for not just working in other countries and international trade, but in this country we're seeing more and more modern slavery appear. And I think there's a very good video in the learning in the courses section for this, talking about modern slavery and the implications on our supply chains. But modern slavery usually includes things like human trafficking, bonded labour, forced labour, child labour, and domestic slavery. All things that we want to try and eradicate, all things that we should be aware of. How are we aware of these things? We should be auditing our suppliers. We should be building their expectations through our specifications in our contracts. And all of these things should be a matter of course. When we talk about the SIP's Code of Conduct, and I need you to know about the SIP's Code of Conduct, and I need you to know about the SIP's Code of Ethics. The SIP's Code of Conduct is an overriding thing. It covers a number of different things. So enhance the protect the standing of the profession. So when we talk about enhancing and protecting the standard of the profession, we talk about things like not accepting gifts, only accepting modest hospitality, being aware of our behaviour outside of the organisation and whether or not we're acting in an appropriate manner, because it will reflect on our organisation. So this idea here builds in a lot of the kind of concepts behind the SIP's Code of Ethics, which we're going to talk about in a second. When we talk about maintaining the highest standard and integrity of our business relationships, it means that we're not acting in a way for our own financial gain. We're not breaching confidentiality. We're ensuring that that we're not acting in a way that might be deemed improper in the way that we operate. When it talks about promoting eradication of unethical processes, we talk about being trying to reduce down things like human rights issues, modern slavery, and trying to improve the working conditions across our supply chain. When we talk about enhancing proficiency of the structure of the profession, Get that out. It's about upskilling not just us as individuals, but our departments, our organisations around what is and isn't appropriate, looking to build in standards of best practice across our supply chains. And then ensuring compliance with laws and regulations, making sure that we're adhering to the laws, well, in the UK, if we're operating in the UK, making sure we're fulfilling our contractual obligations, making sure we're acting in best interest. Okay. When it comes to, so the sixth set of conduct is more about how we operate, how we deal with wider topics, not just how we act in a responsible way as an individual, how we can build that into our supply chain. When we're talking about code of ethics, it's much more based around the individual. So we're acting with integrity. We're not in a position of personal gain. We're working to the highest standards in our profession. We're not accepting bribery or gifts. I won't go through all of them, but I would certainly suggest that you know 5 or 6 of these for the exam, just to make sure that you can, if they ask you about what would go into a code of ethics, and this is the sample question, isn't it? I would definitely know this. I know historically they've asked what were the factors that were included in the code of conduct. So make sure that you know the 5 factors or the 5 major headings and some of the factors that are included in the code of conduct. Make sure you know 5 or 6 of these that are included in the code of ethics. Okay. When we talk about adopting sustainable and that triple bottom line aspect, we might talk about the people. The overriding legislation and guidance around the protection of peoples and social protection is that's from the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Now they represent the UN, the United Nations, and they try and influence governments, and therefore they're trying to influence legislation around what is and isn't appropriate. And you'll see that a lot of the factors and things that we'll talk about are fairly consistent across all kind of social kind of guidance or worker guidance, things like rights of workers, the rights of unions for social dialogue, that everybody's got a certain standard of working conditions, health and safety, etc. Now, that kind of is governmental. It's trying to influence governments. If organisational wise, best practice is usually defined through that of the Ethical Trading Initiative. So this is large organisations like Marks and Spencer's, Tesco, Gap, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to, regardless of international boundaries, they're trying to say, right, what should we be working towards? And so again, it's that employment should be freely chosen. There should be no child labour. There should be no forced labour. There should be minimum wages, maximum working hours. You have the right to be represented within a union and collective bargaining. There should be regular employment provided, which is in conflict with the zero contract hours mentality. So there's a number of things which we as an organisation try and instill. If they asked you, they have historically asked what might be included in a standard in regards to working conditions or a standard for ethics, you might say, or you could look to the Ethical Trading Initiative. I think that's the best, like the most easy language to try and digest. So, adopting sustainable practices, and building that into our specifications, we can ask suppliers to work towards or adhere to the standards set out by the ILO or the ETI. Okay, when we talk about frameworks, again, it's about building in this idea that we are reporting on much more than just our financial success or financial performance. So we have to, as part of the UK, if you're a registered UK company, Companies House, you have to submit your financial reports every year. But we as an organisation can do much more than that. We can build in this idea about reporting on what we've done to increase social value, what our environmental impact has been, and what we've tried to do to improve that. So it's this idea of going beyond just the bare minimum to try and increase and show our supply chain partners what we're doing and how we're doing it to improve. And the other thing is there's benefits there, isn't there, within the organisation, within our customer base, for example, to try and build that trust, to try and improve our brand image, to try and improve our share value by making us more attractive to our customers. Okay, so this idea of what we can do and how it can be built in for particularly within our social outcome, and you see lots of examples of this within the public sector where they try and build it into contracts and then they measure the social impact and the social benefit that's been had by building this into the contracts. And it will filter down the supply chain. So if you say, as a public sector body who are doing a large construction project, for example, building a school or an infrastructure project like building a road or a bridge, and they say to their suppliers, we want you to build something that is socially value adding. So we want you to do something where you're improving the society that we live in while working on this contract. And that can be upskilling, it can be employing apprentices, it can be investing back into the community and community engagement activities. And what happens then is that these large contractors then are looking for ways to offer this so that they can win the contract. And so they start asking their suppliers, right, what can we say that you are doing to improve this, improve society, and it pushes it down the supply chain. So as larger organisations, we have a responsibility to try and build these at the top level requirements, because then it will filter down and it should benefit society as a whole. When we talk about expanding reporting frameworks to include ecological and social performance impact measures, so what can we do? How can we make sure that this is of benefit to society? What kind of activities can we do, and how do we measure that? So for stakeholder perception might be one way of measuring whether or not we're adding value, whether or not they feel like society has been benefited by the way that we're acting. Have our customers felt that they've been treated fairly? Do our suppliers feel like we've been honest and transparent? It might help our reputation, good ethical practices, and benefit to the economy. If we're acting in a socially responsible way, an environmentally friendly way, it might improve the spend and within the economy. You only have to look at the Preston model, which is a model of distributing the spend locally rather than using larger multinational or larger firms. And it suggests that the spending in Preston, based on this idea of splitting large contracts in the public sector, has meant that a far higher amount of money has been retained within the local authority, and that's meant that it's increased the economy within that area. So good, interesting read. There's lots of articles around the Preston model for how organisations can instill and improve economies in certain areas. And then quantitative, where there's ways of measuring what our impact socially, reductions of emissions, amount of funding donated, what have organisations done to try and improve? So have they invested in more energy efficient processes, environmental renewable energies and things like that? What training courses have they delivered, and the percentages resources replaced, so carbon offsetting, planting trees for when you're polluting, etc. So effectively, it's about understanding. I would expect you guys to know bribery, fraud, corruption, modern slavery, what the key things are. They're most likely to ask you about the code of conduct and the SITS code of ethics. They are quite likely to ask you about what you can do to try and instill ethics or try and instill these practices within your supply chain. And the answers are going to be fairly similar across the board. They're going to be about educating your supply chain, building it into specs, building it into your contracts, measuring it after, having KPIs that set suppliers on the route, trying, showing them that that's what you care about, that these are the key things that I want to measure. Making sure that things aren't happening, audits, promoting whistleblowing lines, having separation of duties, delegated spend, rotation of buyers. And all of these things are really important to instill these ethical processes and improve what we're doing and how we're doing it.